Well, I was born in 1996, so I'm in this generational no man's land where I'm neither quite a millennial, but I'm not really a Zoomer or Gen Z. So I might be the oldest person on this panel. So that's a very
I'll leave you to that. Yeah.
interesting position. When thinking about this question, I found myself contemplating how in our culture we don't really have, I don't think, a good word or label for the person who aspires to try to think freely and think for themselves. Often if you have the nerve to oppose a consensus, a popular wisdom, or a trite orthodoxy, you risk being branded with a number of expressions. Contrarian, also common, gadfly, maverick, rebel, loose cannon, angry young man, iconoclast. You're someone who thinks outside the box. These expressions are slightly affectionate and thus at the same time a little bit condescending, as though society was a benign family that tolerates and even admires the eccentricity exhibited by its black sheep. You could even say there is such a thing as a contained opposition in society where a certain, even considerable amount of dissent is permitted by the political order for the purpose of social pacification and political legitimation, where dissidents can satisfy their rebellious urges without meaningfully challenging their rulers or transforming society. Let the youth burn themselves out before they go back to the simple established ideologies that deal with the chaos of reality. This is what Slavoj Žižek called inherent transgression, where society, even or the political order, thrives even on a certain amount of transgression that paradoxically affirm this order itself. However, if you stray too far from the periphery of this box, you risk being associated with less affectionate and less tolerant labels. Fanatic, extremist, malcontent, subversive, some other words with an ist attached on the end. Words with a far and a dash at the beginning. Many people find it really difficult to find the courage to oppose a consensus. Deep inside have grave doubts about. If you're in a minority of one against the majority, you tend to think that you're in the wrong and the majority is right. We're social creatures after all. We don't want to be isolated. It's very easy to take refuge in the security of a consensus or in the majority because that is what you're supposed to think, not because you arrived at that position through the exercise of your own free mind. For example, it is now the consensus and the majority of people, certainly of my generation and younger, to think that the Iraq War, the most monumental foreign policy decision of this century, was wrong, immoral, and a crime. But I can guarantee you, many people will uphold this consensus simply because that's what you're supposed to think as a good person. No one wants to be on the same side as George Bush and Tony Blair. You know, John Stuart Mill in On Liberty said that even if all in a room were agreed on a proposition, it would be essential to give an ear to the person who dissented, lest people forget how to defend and justify their original position. To give a more contemporary and a bit of a sensitive example, the October 7th attacks were past the first year anniversary, commonly billed as the biggest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, and enacted with a fiendish barbarism that has rarely been seen since the Mongols. And say someone dissents from this and says, you know about this October 7th business? I don't really buy it. All that stuff about beheaded babies is balls. And doesn't the Israeli army have a so-called Hannibal doctrine to kill its own civilians to prevent the capture by hostile forces? Now, you may call this person a conspiracy theorist, even anti-Semitic. Maybe you might be right. But this person doesn't just have a right to speak, but their dissent deserves extra protection because what he has to say must have taken him some effort to come up with, might contain a grain of truth to it, and, but more crucially, challenges us to think how and why do we know what we already think we know, other than the fact that we've just been told this and never heard anything else. It's like that old question about how would you prove the earth is round to a flat earth society member, you know? I remember there's a book by Soren Kierkegaard, which has as its title the Latin expression, which Karl Marx affirmed as his favorite motto, which goes like, de omnibus dubitatum, which means all must be doubted. Being an oppositionist or out of step, someone who musters the courage to think for himself isn't meant to be easy. There's always a risk that you will incur a cost from it. In such a scenario, one can actually earn the honorific dissident, as opposed to merely claiming it for yourself as a form of branding because of mere disagreement. But you will at least be able to have a life and not just a job and a career. Don't mistake this aspiration for being on the contrary for its own sake. That is just the path to snobbery. The point is not what you think per se, but how you think. This is really what it means to be a radical, to go by the route, or a free thinker. And I'm reminded of a piece by one of my favorite boomer writers, Christopher Hitchens, in Letters to a Young Contrarian, where he described this high ambition better than I could, that one should strive to combine the maximum of impatience with the maximum of skepticism, the maximum of hatred of injustice and irrationality with the maximum of ironic self-criticism. And I can't think of any better piece of advice for Gen Z than that.
Okay, thank you.